Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Medicine 3.0, your podcast for AI and healthcare precision health. And this week, I've got Colette Vartanian, and she is a specialist in hydration. She's a registered dietitian. She's worked with many athletes, collegiate, professional, and she drops a ton of knowledge on how we should think about hydration for ourselves. So I hope you enjoy. You're going to learn a lot. Colette, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here. Always a great time to chat with other practitioners about stuff we nerd out on.
That's right. Let's see how nerdy we can get.
Yeah.
So to start, though, I would love for people to hear kind of your origin story. How did you end up being where you're at, knowing what you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take it back to my early days at college. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, and I went to USC for my undergrad. I originally went to USC to pursue my degree in pharmacy. I wanted to be a pharmacist. I wanted to do biology and pharmacy school and all those good things. I was taking a nutrition class, and they offered us the opportunity to go and volunteer in the athletics department, working in the fueling station as a student worker. I thought it was a really unique opportunity. I've always been involved in sports. I was a tennis player. I managed our women's basketball team in high school, and I loved like the team sport and working with athletes environment. And so I thought this would just be a great way for me to get a glimpse of what that looks like at the college level. I think as a student at a really big D1 university, you're always curious what's going on in the athletics department because that's all really people were talking about when I was in college. And so within the first 2 weeks, I knew I was going to be a dietitian. I literally went to my counselor, was like, how do I make this happen? Little did I know there was a lot of more schooling to be done. And so I actually went to grad school at the University of Oklahoma to be able to do my master's as well as get my professional credentials to be a dietitian. For me, after going to Oklahoma, I decided I wanted to still pursue sports. And so I would consider myself a sports dietitian or a performance dietitian. Those are the specialties that I kind of focus my time in. You probably won't catch me in a hospital or in an outpatient clinic, but I think as a dietitian, we're pretty well rounded. During my time at USC in Oklahoma, I worked in the athletic departments. I also worked with US Paralympic sitting volleyball, which super excited for the Paralympics to be heading up now that the Olympics are slowly on their close. But with the women's sitting volleyball team, I worked with our OU hockey club as well as the athletics department, tried to get as much experience in sports as I possibly could. From there, I ended up doing my internship at the Seattle Seahawks, and finishing that up, I did a fellowship year at a performance center in Indiana where I got to serve hundreds of different kinds of athletes. So I was working with triathletes, endurance athletes, firefighters, professional basketball players, IndyCar racing drivers and pit crews. So I got to see a huge vast of different athletes outside of just the typical collegiate setting that we usually work in. And there, I actually got a really big glimpse of learning about hydration testing. So my mentor there, she had been hydration testing for many, many years, and learned all these different methods. And we were testing athletes on site and even at their organizations. We would travel to them to test athletes. And so through that, I got a huge glimpse of what hydration knowledge really existed out there and what a lot of people were lacking. That's kind of where I got my, I guess, specialty or where my special interests are as a dietitian. And leading to that, I ended up moving to Colorado to work for a sports hydration company called Scratch Labs. Scratch was founded by a cyclist and an exercise physiologist. And Dr. Alan Lim worked on the world tour in cycling, realized there was a lot of hydration needs for athletes, and decided to develop a product he was actually using during the pro tour that he now wanted to commercialize for athletes to have access to better hydration that was focused on the science. And so I was lucky enough to be brought on to the team as their athlete care manager and helping all of our athletes, all of our customers understand how to fuel and hydrate for the sports or whatever their goal is in their performance. And so I've done hundreds and hundreds of hydration tests. I've done tons of education, and I'm still learning new things every single day, which is, I think, what's really fascinating.
I love that background. I mean, a real breadth of knowledge and expertise. And a couple things stuck out to me. One is,
Mm-hmm.
you said that you're helping all these athletes, but as you talked about it, you talked about how really everybody is an athlete, whether they're a weekend
Mm-hmm.
warrior, whether they're an everyday person trying to exercise or just live their best life. And I kind of think of it as like we're all athletes of our own life, like how
Mm-hmm.
athletic we are or how professional we are in that may depend on how much time and effort we want to
Yeah.
put into it. And then the other thing that I really loved was that you said you're still learning. And I feel like people who truly become expert at something understand how little we know. Like it's the people
Yes.
who like they make those hard statements for sure this or for sure that. They probably don't know a lot. And it's the people
That's
who
absolutely true.
understand more. Yeah.
I'm always questioning, do I actually know what I'm talking about? Am I up to date on the research? Have I tried this different method, or am I sure that that's the way that it's really supposed to work? I question everything every day. And I think that's a big part of just understanding your body too. At Scratch, we like to say that we do a lot of our own me search. And so you can have like foundations, you can have the research studies to base off of, you can have a really good idea of what is supposed to happen. But really, what we want to be doing is our own me search, because nothing is as blanketed as we want it to be. Nutrition and hydration, it's all one size fits all. Health in general is not one size fits all. We all have to figure out and do our own me search to
Yeah.
like know if something's going to work or not. And so what may work for me may definitely not work for you, and that's okay. Um, and so that's where the hard science like gets me thrown off, of where I'm like, I don't really know if I know everything. And I don't think, as much as I feel like I have advanced in the field, there's I'm always questioning if I'm an expert, because there's always something new to learn, or something that worked for one of my athletes that absolutely traumatized my other athlete when we tried it with them. And so, especially with hydration and fueling, everything is based on how your gut feels. And so, there can be a lot of trauma around experimenting in this sense. Whereas some other experimenting we do doesn't usually cause that much um, issues for people.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's spoken with anybody who's done, races, we've all heard the horror stories of the GI distress in the middle of the race, and that's not the
Hmm.
time to do your me search.
Yeah,
You need
not
to
the
do that.
time. Do not wait till the big weekend, big race, big
Yeah,
anything. If that's the one you're counting on, please don't try something new. Do not do your research. Do it on your own time, when you
yeah,
know you can access different things or take a break. Because I've seen it. I mean, even with now everyone's watching the Olympics right now. I
yeah,
would say in my realm at least, and I think in the endurance space, everyone always talks about how much they want to do a triathlon, and how that's the pinnacle of, like, it used to be just doing a marathon, and now it's like
right.
everyone is pushing it to the next extreme, and they're like, I'm going to do an Ironman triathlon, which is one of the most challenging of the levels of triathlon. Also,
Yeah,
people really don't know how many different levels of every sport that we do that there is. Um,
yeah,
and then you're watching the highlights of the triathlon finishes, and everybody just throwing everything up at the finish line. And
yeah,
then you realize, maybe I don't want to be doing this sport unless I really understand my body. But it's
yeah.
remarkable. It doesn't matter what level you're at. you will have gut problems. And it's surprising to me how much of those gut problems can be alleviated by better hydration protocols. I
Yeah.
didn't think that they would be so closely tied, but hydration affects our digestive system so much that sometimes a quick change to a hydration protocol with an athlete can mean so many differences for them when they're exercising or even in
Mm.
their day to day of how much energy they have and how they feel throughout the day. I've just really realized my athletes who start focusing on their hydration and trying to figure out that puzzle piece, a lot of the other performance stuff they're doing tends to start to fall into place as they're researching or me searching their hydration.
Yeah.
So it's pretty
So
fascinating.
let's start with going through kind of some of the frameworks you might use with somebody, and how does somebody start doing their own research? Like, what frameworks do you use? What do you kind of tell people to start out when they say, okay, I want to figure out this whole hydration thing?
Yeah, so I always start with just the basic education. So this is really my like elevator pitch on hydration when someone asks me like what should I be doing? The
Mhm.
first thing you have to really know is there's two components to your sweat. It's how much or how much volume you're losing. So that can be, anywhere. Some of my athletes half a liter, and some of them they're up on the higher level of like 3 or 4 liters. And so you need to figure out how much volume you're losing. That's really dependent on the temperature, what you're wearing, the intensity of your activity, the type of activity, the time of year. There's so many factors that go into how much you're losing. But then you have the second factor, which is what is in your sweat. What are you actually losing? What's coming out of those sweat glands? And how are we going to replace that bit that is leaving our body? So you have that piece, which we have tied to be a lot more genetic.
Mm.
There's a much higher genetic component to that, where, yes, there can be some variable changes in your sweat sodium concentration or electrolyte composition overall, but it doesn't change as drastically as your volume does. So morning to
Mm.
night, you could be losing, very different numbers when it comes to volume of sweat. But when it comes to what's coming out of your sweat, it kind of stays within a range for yourself. So I always say you are in a t-shirt size, and that t-shirt might get looser or tighter as depending on the circumstances you're in, but you won't go from like a small to a triple X. Like that just won't happen with what's happening in your sweat. So once you know those two pieces and you can do a little bit of research on figuring out those two pieces, you are now able to not only understand how much your needs are, so how much fluid should I be taking in and what does my body really demand for me to keep up with my performance, but what is going in my bottle. So when I'm exercising versus not exercising, are those the same? Are they different? What should I be paying attention to? And so that's the first thing I really say to a lot of my athletes is you got to understand what's happening with sweat.
So how do you do that? How do you do the sweat test to figure out
Yeah.
like this is how much you're losing and this is what it's made up of?
Yeah, so volume is quite easy because anyone can do this at home. If you have
Mhm.
a scale, this is like one of the tests that you can constantly retest. And as a practitioner, I like my athletes to retest depending on the sports that they're doing, the intensity levels, even if like they've changed body comp and they're trying to assess like now in this new body what do I sweat like. This is something usually I'll have my athletes test a couple times a year at least, even more if they're having a lot of hydration issues. But all you need is a scale. You weigh yourself before you go out. Ideally you want to be minimally clothed. If not, you are wearing what you wore on that scale back on the scale once you're done. So that's like the continuity is really important. And then also keeping track of whatever you drank during that time and if you urinated during that time. Hop on the scale, do your stuff, hop on the scale again, and then you can basically, there's tons of calculators online. You plug in the before and the after, and if you drank anything, and it plugs out how many ounces per hour. you lost. And so from there, we can guide someone. And so if you lost 30 ounces an hour, that would mean you're losing almost a liter. And so we need to be working on replacing a certain volume of that, depending on the activity and how it makes you feel. So the volume part is really easy. You can test it all over the place. I used to bring scales with me everywhere. If I had an athlete out in the field, they're a trail runner, they are a climber, they are, a rower, whatever it is, I could bring a scale with me. And that's something easy so I can figure out how to adjust that in real time. The sweat sodium concentration, that can be done in a ton of different ways nowadays, but there are several different methods, and that is a test you only really need to do once or twice in your lifetime.
Hmm.
I will say, like, because we think it's a genetic component and that there's very little variability, once you have that sweat sodium concentration number, you can do a little bit of range experimenting without having to do that test again. It just gets you in a place where you're like, this is my starting point. Now I'm going to play around with 200 milligrams of sodium more, maybe 200 milligrams of sodium less. Maybe depending on the volume that I'm drinking, I might adjust some of those things. But the sweat sodium concentration, originally, when we're thinking about the way we're taught in biology and in a lot of our labs and exercise physiology classes, a whole body washdown is what we consider to be that gold standard. I don't
Hmm.
know if any of you guys have seen a whole body washdown, but they are
No.
quite invasive. You preferably are fully naked. We're collecting 100% of the sweat from every part of your body. So they're just dumping water on you and collecting it
Hmm.
in a tarp underneath you. And so
Yeah.
I don't really want to be doing that with most of my athletes, and really only are we using this in a lab setting where you have very small amount of participants. But
Yeah.
thankfully, we have figured out there's many more ways to test this and still as reliable as that method, but not as invasive. So what
Hmm.
I typically use and what I was taught on is this device called the Westcore device. This is a non-invasive method that requires zero exercise. This is what I typically use because it's really easy to minimize some of the other factors that may affect your sweat and your hydration levels and all of those. We don't have to have a crazy protocol before. You don't have to not eat, not drink. You can do everything. You can even exercise before you come in and get a sweat test using that device. So for us, it's really easy to be able to have that for our athletes because they're all over the world. They're, not always where our office is, and I can travel with that device. But nowadays, even more than that, there's wearable devices that my athletes are purchasing or mailing in their sweat and being able to get the same information, which for me as a practitioner is great because I now have more options and can figure out something that works for all of my athletes. So now I'm using stuff alongside this that may be a little bit more untraditional. I will say all of these devices have their pros and cons. I will say there's no perfect device, there's no perfect method. As a practitioner, for me, it's what works best for my client and what makes the most sense cost wise, access wise. What information are we really trying to gather from this? And so now we're seeing things like you can collect your sweat, they send you a kit, you mail it out, they tell you the results. Amazing option for a lot of people because that allows them to still do the test while they're exercising, get a little bit more information from it. They can get the sweat rate as well as the sweat sodium concentration, and they just
Hmm.
mail it in and someone does the work for them and gives them their results and a big plan. That's called the Level-In test. They're a company that you can mail in your sweat. The other options now is like devices that you can buy online anywhere. A lot of the performance-based companies, uh, I would say, are selling or promoting some of these, and I think they're great as well. So you have the two I would say are the most used by my athletes would be the Nix hydration sensor. Um, that's one where it's a patch and you put the wearable on your arm and it collects both your volume and the concentration of your sweat. So you're doing those two tests all in one device, which is really nice. The other one that does the same too as well is another device called the H-Drop. Again, does the same thing, volume and concentration. So that might be really helpful. These devices are helpful for people maybe who participate in several different sports. They want more real-time information and some metrics on how to do better with their hydration, or they just want a way for them to do their own research and they want to be testing all the time and tweaking things. And then I would say also one that's a very affordable option. Don't know if it always works the best for everybody, but I always like to say there's a different range of options for people. But Gatorade also has a sweat patch. You buy it, they sell them at Dick's Sporting Goods, I think. I think that's the only place you can really buy them now. But it's a patch you put on your forearm, it connects to an app, and it calculates some of it. I will say some are more specific with their results than others are. And I will say one is not really better than the other. I think it all depends on what an athlete is looking for and what their practitioner is also trying to help them figure out. All of them give you a baseline of somewhere to start, because that result is not like 100% of the time going to be what you exactly need. And that's the frustrating part about nutrition and hydration, is that I can give you a number and you could do that same thing every single day, and it may get you somewhere and it may not get you somewhere. And it's all because we're all individuals, and it makes it really frustrating for some people. But I think that's the fun part, because you're always tweaking, you're always improving stuff, and you're always learning more about yourself. So once you do those tests, you now have enough knowledge to be able to do your own tweaking.
It is fascinating, and you and I were talking beforehand that if you're on social media, if you listen to very many health podcasts, you might think that you should only drink salt, like because everybody is pushing product so hard. Like there's one podcast, I love the people who do it, but they talk about, like, I drink an element in the morning, I drink an element in the afternoon, I drink an. And I'm just like, I hope you're exercising between these, but I'm curious for you, so if you take somebody and you say, okay, I know your volume now, I know the makeup of your sweat, how much sodium you're losing. And of course you've already kind of educated me that it's not going to be perfect. When you come out with my hydration plan, there's going to be a range, and we're going to be doing our research, we're going to be testing, figuring out what works for us. But what are you going to kind of guide me on? And you can even give some presumptive numbers, like you're losing a liter an hour, temperatures like 60 degrees on most days, because if it goes above 60, I don't like to run. That's like my honest truth. I'm like, it's above 60, I can't run. That's crazy.
Yeah. So. Oh, well, you don't want to be living in California right now, because I don't think I've seen 60-degree temperatures in weeks, months at this point. But I think once you get this information, what are you supposed to do with it? Should we be drinking hydration beverages all the time? Those are really great questions, and something that I get from everybody all the time. So once you get this, let's say you lose a liter an hour. Athletes lose on average somewhere between 800 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium when we're testing them. So let's say you're right in the average, you're at 800 and you lose a liter an hour. So what I usually guide my athletes to do is to look at whatever products they're purchasing. I am not one of those, like, you have to stick to one brand, this is the only product that works. I think that everyone has individual preferences, so taste is a really big one. If you don't like the way something tastes, don't drink it. What are you forcing yourself to do? It doesn't make it enjoyable, especially if you're an endurance athlete and you have to drink this for hours and hours on end. Don't force yourself into something that you don't like the taste of. So taste really matters for me for athletes, because I do really think that's important. People always try to push like performance over taste. Habits don't build if you don't like something. And so if I can improve a habit by finding you something that tastes good, that's really important. So whatever you're using, make sure you like the taste of it. What you really want to look at is that sodium concentration. And so like I have a packet of Scratch here. So any of these products, they have a nutrition facts label. And so what you want to do is look like wherever it is and look for that sodium. That's what you're looking for. Yes, they can say they have thousands of electrolytes in there and they have, all the electrolytes you need. This is an electrolyte packed beverage. The only electrolyte that matters when you are exercising is sodium, because it provides the quickest shift in your blood volume that your body needs. And so electrolytes, all of them are great. We have magnesium, potassium, we have zinc, we have calcium, we have all of these other electrolytes that aid us in staying hydrated. But during exercise, sodium is the only one that's important. So find that beverage. Most, at least in the US, most beverages for electrolytes are like put on a serving size of about 16 ounces. That's half a liter. So whatever you're doing, you want to figure out the serving size. So if you lose a liter an hour, I want you to put back a liter. If you only use one serving, you're only getting enough for half a liter. You may need to double that up or drink more beverage, or you might have two 16-ounce bottles that have one scoop of whatever you're drinking in. But you really want to make sure you're getting the right amount of sodium matched to what you're losing per hour. So 800 milligrams of sodium per liter, and you lose 1 liter, you really only need to replace about 100 milligrams of sodium. So find the product that works for you. If you're on the higher range, you might want a specialty product. You might want those things like Element or the Right Stuff, or you might want to add extra electrolytes into whatever you're drinking. There's a lot of different brands out there, and all the brands have different varying levels. I'll say Gatorade, which is what we all think of as like the number one sports drink. Whenever we think sports drink, we think Gatorade. It's ingrained in our culture. It's ingrained in our brains. That's actually on the lower end. That's closer to maybe a 200, 250 milligram of sodium per liter. That's quite low for a lot of people. And so if you're a salty sweater and you just keep drinking Gatorades, you're never going to really catch up to what your body wants. You're going to get a lot of fluid, but you're not going to get enough electrolytes. And so paying attention to whatever your product is that you're going to use and what that sodium content is important. Yes, potassium is important. All the other electrolytes are important. But what I tend to find is that most people are eating foods that have those electrolytes in them, and they don't have as much of a direct effect on performance. And so I encourage my athletes, have a banana before a workout, have a smoothie with leafy greens before a workout or after. You're going to replenish those electrolytes that way with whole food products and get the same benefit. And it's not necessarily super necessary during. Potassium is an interesting one though. I always get questions about like, what about coconut water or some of the electrolyte beverages like Body Armor or Prime, or even the coconut beverages that are all at the grocery stores. What about those for hydration? Because everyone always says they're such great hydrators. Yes, they're great hydrators when you're not exercising, because you're not losing sodium. So for the people who are drinking sodium heavy electrolyte beverages throughout the day, those are only really necessary when you're sweating. When you're exercising and you're losing large volumes of sodium, that's when we want to be drinking electrolyte beverages with salt. When you're not exercising, let's say I'm just sitting at my desk all day, but it is hot and I'm sweating, but I know I need to be hydrating, but I don't really know what I should be drinking. That's when I would lean towards a coconut beverage or a low sodium salted beverage. There's so many different options. You don't really need a lot of salt, because when you're sweating outside of exercise, you actually don't release as much sodium in your sweat. It's only during exercise that we lose large amounts of sodium in our sweat. So understanding timing is really important for you, because you don't want to overdo salt, because we know longevity wise, there's some repercussions to high sodium diets. We don't want someone with high hypertension or history of heart disease to be consuming a lot of salt outside of their daily exercise, especially if you're more of I would say you're a recreational exerciser, or you're someone who's just getting into exercise. There's a lot of mixed messaging out there. And so
Yeah.
salt is important, but I would say for the longevity of my athletes, like if we don't need to do extra salt, we don't really. The only times I add electrolyte beverages outside of exercise is if we're pre-hydrating for a big event that we know is really hot. If you've started off dehydrated or you're sick, where you're like, I'm not at my normal hydration potential. When it comes to volume too, and I guess I missed this part, if you are losing more than a liter of volume, for most people, you can't drink more than a liter an hour. If you've ever tried to drink more than a liter of fluid in an hour, you will start seeing your stomach distend. You'll feel the sloshiness in your stomach when you're running. So if you are a high volume sweater and you're like, I can't get more than a half of a liter down in an hour, how do you make up for that lost volume that you're not drinking? That's when we may play around with adding more salt in so that what you are drinking is getting held into your system more. So I usually say you will probably consume about 50 to 70% of what your lost volume is, as long, and like it's okay to do that as long as you're adding electrolytes to the mix. If you're drinking plain water, you're going to have a hard time staying with that amount of volume loss. You won't hold on to as much of it as you would hope you would. So sorry if
Okay.
that's
So,
long-winded. I feel like I threw a
no,
lot of stuff. So maybe you do a little bit of a
yeah, let's do a
summary or
summary
recap.
and see if I got it. So
Yeah.
we know that I'm losing a liter an hour. We know that I'm losing 800 milligrams of salt per hour.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say if I'm going to do a multi-hour race, well, like
Mm-hmm.
last year I went to Phoenix and I did a Spartan long race. It was a 30K
Yep.
Spartan race.
Mm-hmm.
And so for that race, I tried to kind of pre-hydrate and then hydrate during, but my goal should have been about, you know, a half, or you said 70% of what I lose. So
Mm-hmm.
700 milliliters of water or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. So a half a liter to 700 milliliters, and then try to replace my salt. So 800 milligrams of salt per hour.
Yep.
Is that kind of the general? So try to replace as much water as you can to what's comfortable. Try to replace the sodium, and that should keep your blood volume as high as possible during the event.
That's exactly it. That's really as simple as it gets. And I always tell people, your body's pretty intuitive. So it'll tell you if you need more fluid, you will be thirsty. If you don't
Yeah.
need as much fluid, you will not be thirsty. The only time that I really see that kind of goes out the window, and this is where some of the experimenting goes, is altitude. Um, Nothing,
Yeah.
your brain does not tell you anything correctly when you're at altitude because you have such a lack of oxygen and such a high demand on your
Mhm.
body that you can't be intuitive in those times. But for the most part, if you are thirsty, drink more fluid. If you're not thirsty, don't drink as much. Listen to your body a little bit more. As I always tell people, if you have what matches your sweat in your bottle, it's a lot easier to be a little bit more lax on how much you need. But I always say you
Mm.
have to have a minimum still. So, like for you losing a liter, I would say no less than half a liter an hour would be ideal. And if you can get more in or you are more thirsty, you can do more than that. You can get up to a liter, but it's very situational. And I think that that's the stuff that people don't realize is that I can give you the perfect plan, but I mean, I'm sure for your race too, you probably had this perfect plan in your head of how everything was going to go and what you were going to eat and what you were going to drink. And most likely, and I would say 80% of the time, it doesn't go perfectly. And so
Yeah.
being able to learn how to adjust. So if it's hotter, can I add a little bit more salt into my beverage? Can I have more of a salty snack during my exercise? Can I maybe fuel myself or hydrate earlier in the day? So if my start time is at 8, maybe when I woke up at 4:35 for my race, I already had a bottle next to my bed that I can start sipping on to make sure I'm hydrating well. So there is some adjustments, and I think once you learn your body, you kind of are able to, but that's my general start place for most of my athletes is we get that information, that's where we're going to start. And as we learn more about what works, then we make adjustments. But this can really make a huge difference for a lot of people.
I've heard, and I don't hear it quite as much as I used to, but I've heard in the past, like everybody's chronically dehydrated. And I've kind of my rule of thumb that I've told patients is exactly what you said. Like if you're hungry, or thirsty, your body will tell you you're thirsty and you'll drink
Mm-hmm.
water.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what should we make of that? Do you think that that is not absolutely true, that we're all kind of chronically dehydrated and not getting enough fluids or enough salt? And of course, like Tom Brady is famous for like drinking his however much gallons of water a day and
Mm-hmm.
saying, "Do you want your muscles to look like a tenderloin or like beef jerky?" And I always just kind of
Yeah.
laugh and just think that's
Uh,
crazy. But
I think that there's some truth to it. Like, I do think that it's much harder to stay really well hydrated. Like, as far as when I look at testing and urine specific gravity and all of those things,
Hmm,
I will say it's harder for me to say that someone is going to always be well hydrated. But there is a physiological need for there to be some slight dehydration. It allows for some processes in our body to take place. And I also think that there's so many factors that come into hydration that you're not going to be perfect at it all the time. Just the same way that you're not always going to be well fed or like hit your calorie marks. You're the same thing with hydration. It's not going to be perfect all the time. And what we've seen a lot in some of the most elite athletes and the research that we've done in like running and cycling is that some of the highest competitors are actually more like, we usually use a metric, or it's used a lot in sports, where more than 2% of a body weight loss means that you are, at a performance detriment and you're chronically dehydrated. I've seen athletes cross finish lines that are 5, 6, 7, 9% dehydrated. What we're starting to see in the research that's kind of interesting is we think that there's more of a needs to be more of an understanding of the compartments in which where we hold our fluids, so intracellularly versus extracellularly. And so that may even be genetic. And so someone who holds their fluid in different parts of their body may be able to be much more dehydrated, but still have high plasma volume and high performance rates. And so this is where things get really complicated. That's where I'm like, there's no perfect answer to anything. But I will
yeah.
say, I think most people are more dehydrated than hydrated. It's hard to stay on top of it, especially when you don't know that stuff. But I also don't think the solution is drinking gallons and gallons of water a day, because there is some truth to what Tom Brady said, where like you want beef jerky versus like a fresh cut steak. When you're well hydrated, injury is a lot less likely to happen. And that's what we're trying to prevent a lot of times. But
Hmm,
also, if you drink too much plain water,
yeah.
what you're ending up doing is diluting yourself. And this is where people who are new to exercise or new to sport or new to working through their hydration and nutrition, they always think more is better. Water is great. It hydrates us. It allows nutrients to move through our body. It allows digestion to happen better, so you're not having as many GI issues. But more is not necessarily better in this sense, because the gallon challenge has been out there, all these methods of like, you should be drinking your body weight in ounces. It can be very dangerous, because what really happens is when you drink a lot of plain water without those electrolytes, whether there's salt in there or not, the things like potassium, magnesium, zinc, chloride, all those things, if you don't have those in your beverages, you are diluting the electrolytes. And so essentially what I explain to people is that you're waterboarding yourself. You are just drowning your body with plain water and nothing for it to hold on to that water with. And so you are just oversaturating yourself. And that's what we call hyponatremia, and what we're really concerned about as practitioners, because the symptoms of hyponatremia are very similar to dehydration. In my professional opinion, it can be very hard for me to determine if someone is reporting symptoms of dehydration or overhydration based just solely on the symptoms. Sometimes I have to ask them, what are you doing before this? What were you doing? Were you drinking a lot of fluid, or were you drinking nothing at all? because
Yeah.
it's fascinating to me how similar the side effects can be for a lot of people. And so that can be really dangerous for athletes. So more is not always better. And to be honest, I prefer to eat my salt and eat my carbs and eat
Yeah.
all of my things. So I won't really drink much of that stuff because I would prefer to eat it. And everyone's different. I have athletes who are like, just give me the bottle of whatever to drink. And I'm like, okay, we are two different animals here.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting to see, but you don't need to be carrying a gallon of water everywhere. Really doesn't make a huge impact, but it's
Yeah.
really interesting the misconceptions that are out there about hydration.
Yeah. Well, I think so much of this is fascinating because there it's the both things are true where like it is true hydration is very important if you want to compete at a high level and you want to do your best,
Mm-hmm.
like it's super important if you're at that level. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're a casual athlete, then hydration if you're going for longer than an hour is important, and yes,
Mm-hmm.
replace salt. But if you're exercising 30 minutes a day and, lifting weights 30 minutes a day,
Yeah.
then yeah, you can replace your salt or not. And
Yeah.
you'll probably be okay. You can eat your
Mm-hmm.
salt if you want, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Most exercise under an hour doesn't really need electrolytes or sports drinks or even really fueling in general. I will tell my athletes, if you set up your pre and your post of a workout really well, whether it's your hydration protocol or your nutrition protocol, if you have your bookends done really well, if you have a short workout, you don't really need anything. It's really when we get over an hour when I start to think about how we're going to fuel and hydrate. But under an hour, unless you're a really salty sweater or you're in like a hot environment and you're not used to it. So like let's say your first time doing a hot yoga class, yes, it's
Mm,
under an hour and you are not maybe doing as much strenuous exercise, but it is still making you sweat and it's something that's new to you. And so we may want to add in electrolytes in a situation like that. And so things become very situational, but really I focus on electrolytes and hydration protocols much more regimented, I guess, or more like we really focus on it more as we get past that hour mark or you're doing
right.
something that's extremely high intensity. So with my sprinters, or like anybody who's doing really high, quick intensity exercise for a short amount of time, I still do focus on electrolytes with them, but it's because in situationally for what they need, that's what they need. But for most athletes, for me, if I'm going to Pilates or I'm going to play tennis for less than an hour, or I'm, going to yoga or even just going for a walk or a run under an hour, probably not going to be grabbing a sports drink unless there's a couple factors that play into me needing it. So
Mm,
yeah, for most people, unless you're running an ultra, riding a bike for hours, like not as necessary. I do think maintaining your hydration is important, but focusing on that during hydration protocol, it's very situational based.
yeah. Well, and like you kind of alluded to, more and more people are doing extreme sports. I know
Mm-hmm.
way more ultra people than I knew before, way more triathlon people
Mm-hmm.
than I knew before. So I think super important what you do. The people you work with obviously gain a ton from your knowledge. If people want to learn more about you or anything you do, should they try to find you on social? Is there anywhere that you'd point
Yeah.
them?
Yeah. So the company that I've worked for is called Scratch Labs, scratchlabs.com. We have tons of blogs on hydration, fueling, all of that stuff. But if you want to chat with me personally on hydration or fueling or any of the experiences that I've had, or even how I got to where I'm at, and if I can help you in any way, you can find me on Instagram at Cole, Cole Nutrition. And so happy to chat. I know that this is such a nuanced topic and there has to be more education out there. There's some really great groups that I work with that use our education and our knowledge. And I think that there's a lot of great practitioners out there that are also spreading this information. But check out my page. I've done quite a few podcasts on hydration as well in other places. So if I can enlighten people, I am happy to do it and answer questions because I know it's a complicated topic. So that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Colette, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And
Yeah, thank you
I'm
so
sure
much for
people
having me.
will look you up. Yeah, thanks. Take
Great.
care.
Thanks.